No, I've got everybody now, including all my relatives are signing in from,
Okay.
from
Okay.
all over the place. So it's nice. Okay, now I get to see the room, and I see some friends in the crowd there, and I have my distant cousin Bob Steinberg there with the big white beard, who is going to tell me things that I get wrong.
Bob.
So and
Okay.
my cousin by marriage Harvey is there, and I mean he is a real historian of these things, so I had really better get it right.
Yep.
And let's see who's in the room there. That's oh, and you see we have Morden people from all over. There's Joan Larkey. Hi, Joan. And this is great. This is okay. Yeah, very cool.
More volume, Tina, if you can get it.
Yeah, well, volume up.
Volume up, there we go.
Hey, can you say something now?
Sure.
Okay, is that better?
This is a test. Are we? Oh yeah, I see lots of people, and but I'll leave you, Cheryl, to kind of run the proceedings, and you know, just tell me what you when my part comes on.
I think we'll let Cheryl do the introduction, and then I think we can start after that.
Okay, terrific.
And thank you everyone for being here, and I think there's more than 20 people.
Maybe.
Just before I do the introduction, I just want to let you know that David can hear what we're saying, and it's all being recorded. So the video or the audio with the recording is in place right now. David Rabinovitch is a journalist, filmmaker, and author. His work has received numerous honors, including 3 Emmys, the Peabody Medal, and Canada's Gemini for Best Director for his miniseries, Secret Files of the Inquisition. David's professional career began as a teenager with a column for his hometown weekly newspaper, the Morden Times. Growing up in town, his influences included CBC Radio and his parents' subscription to the Sunday edition of the New York Times, which weighed 5 pounds and arrived by train about 12 days late. As a boy, he spent evenings in the projection booth at the Kenmore Theatre with Ernie Kendall, a family friend. Those influences led him to a career which has resulted in filming on 5 continents. His most recent work is the book Jukebox Empire, The Mob and the Dark Side of the American Dream, which begins in Morden and tells the story of his Uncle Bill, the black sheep of the Rabinovitch family. Please welcome David Rabinovitch.
Well, hi everybody. I'm quite amazed by the interest in this, and I was delighted when Cheryl got in touch with me a couple of months ago and asked if I would talk about the history of the Jewish community in Morden. And it strikes me, of course, I would have loved to be in town personally, but we tend to avoid winters now, and it strikes me in light of what we're going to talk about today that it's rather astonishing. We're going to talk about a history beginning about 135 years ago. And I'm talking to you now from the southern tip of the Baja California Peninsula. So it's around 4,000 miles from where you're sitting on Railway Avenue in Morden. And you know, I could just, how could my ancestors even comprehend this, that these people who came from poverty and fleeing persecution and arrived in this little place, you know, on the prairies in what was really then the middle of nowhere, and to know that a descendant could be spending a winter where I am, and yet still feel very connected to this special community. So I'd also like to point out, so, you know, the history of the Jewish community in Morden begins in the 1880s. That my sisters and I are the last descendants of the original Jewish families to be born in Morden. And in fact, I'm in the generation, as I know some of you are also, who was born in the Freemasons Hospital, and which my grandfather helped to build in 1892. Much of what I've learned has been through oral history, in stories told by my father Milton, other family members and friends. I've also spent considerable time with a trove of documents that came available when we opened up the old safe at the back of the Rabinovitch Brothers building on Stephen Street. And that was in 1997. So I've also had, over the years, a lot of research with the public records of the town, old newspapers, the Dominion census, films, photographs. So I'm not a historian, I'm a journalist. So we have a kind of combination of these, this information, some of it, as I said, passed on through oral history, others in more documentary form. And thinking about what I would say to this group today, I thought that the best way might be, best approach would be by telling you the narrative of my grandfather, David Rabinovitch, for whom I am named. And through his story, we'll meet many of the characters who were part of that community. Now, I think also, as I said a few moments ago, but talk to you in Morden from Baja, California, let's consider the era in which this story begins. Late 1880s, no cell phones, no computers, no television, no radio, no automobiles, and how to put, you know, for those of us in this day, I don't know how to put our minds back into what all of those people had to endure, the challenges, the physical challenges that they went through to survive and build a community and build their lives. So that's kind of my preface. Now, my grandfather came from a little shtetl, a village that was about 40 kilometers from Kiev. It was a place called Ternovka, and as with almost all of these places, they're now completely obliterated and wiped off the map. He was married at the age of 17. In the custom of the time, it was an arranged marriage. He learned the grain trade from his father-in-law, which was again a custom that a man married into the family and then learned his father-in-law's business. So again, an essential part of this is to understand that at that time and for centuries, Jews were not permitted to own land in most of Europe. So they didn't become farmers, but because of the emphasis on education, they often were the only people who could read and write and do mathematics. And that led often to their the work that they would do. So my grandfather, as a young man, learned to broker in grain crops. And the story as passed on to us is that around 1889 or 1890, he was carrying a load of grain, and he was stopped by a friendly non-Jewish townsman, and who said, "Look, you'd better get out of here. The Cossacks are coming. There's going to be a pogrom, and you've got to get to safety." And if any of us today try to understand the definition of the word pogrom, just look at the footage of October 7th, 2023 in Israel. This was a pogrom. And that's what so many of these people were fleeing. So by that time, my grandfather had 3 little girls. And the story as related is that he went to the family home, he scribbled a note that he was leaving for America and he would send for his family when he could. That's sometime in 1890. Well, and he started to walk. And if you look at a map, it's a long way. His destination was Danzig, which is now Gdansk in Poland, but was then part of Germany. And as he walked from village to village, he was sheltered in other little Jewish villages. And along the way, he met a man named Jake Corman, who was a Romanian, and they walked together. When they got to Danzig, they found that they had just missed the ship to New York. And they were kind of distraught what to do. They encountered a man on the docks who was an agent for the Baron de Hirsch, who was an Austrian Jewish philanthropist who had taken on the project of resettling Jews in the Western Hemisphere, both in Canada and in Argentina, and attempting to create farming colonies. But the Baron de Hirsch's agent talked to my grandfather and Foreman and said, "Look, there's a ship going to Canada tomorrow. We'll pay your passage on the ship." And they looked and said, "Canada?" They'd never heard of it. I mean, they weren't, we didn't have the kind of information that we have now, and consider where they had come from. And but they said, "Look, the conditions are good for the Jews in Canada. There's freedom. It's the same as USA." Well, let's not get into that in today's context. But so they took up the offer, and when they rode, I'm sure, in steerage, several levels below deck, they landed in Halifax. Corman said, "I see where we are. I'm going to New York." My grandfather met, again, when they arrived, met a recruiter from the CPR, from the Canadian Pacific Railroad, and who made him an offer. He said, "Look, we need workers for the harvest in the West, and we'll pay your passage on the train in return for working in the harvest in the fall when you get there." The story as related is my grandfather had a question. He said, "Is there land there?" And they said, "Oh yes, there's more land than you could imagine." And it was astonishing to him, given what I related a few minutes ago, that in this country, Jews could buy and own land. So he took up the offer. And I suppose this is the place, not having done it formally, where we should make a land acknowledgement to our indigenous friends on whose land the town of Morden and many others were created. So he got on the train, and he was sent to Morden to work on the harvest. Surely, like for many others, the setting with the creek and the first prairie escarpment reminded him of where he had come from. It was like the countryside in Ukraine. And he knew about grain from his experience. By this time, he's about, it's 1891, and he's about 22 years old, according to the documentation that we have. So he worked off his passage on the harvest, and he was welcomed by a small group of German Jewish families, the Hymans, Rosens, Tobias family, who had arrived a few years earlier. And the German Jews had a different situation than the Russian Jews. They generally had some kind of an occupation. They had enough financial resources to get themselves to North America. So he was well liked, and he was taken in. We were told that he spent the winter with the Hyman family, and he also taught. There was the Steinkopf family who had come from Prague. He taught young Max Steinkopf to read and write in Yiddish. Now, some of you may recognize the names of some of these people. We're going back 135 years, but of course, many had descendants who made major contributions to the community at large. But it was pretty good there. And he wrote to his friend Corman, who he'd met, traveling along the way, and said, why don't you come out here? There's lots of opportunity. You won't have to be, scraping it together in New York. So Corman did make his way to Morden. This is a little kind of side story about the community, but Jake Corman was known as Corman der Schwarzer, because it's the Yiddish term for black, he had a black beard. Then he brought a younger brother, came to join him, who had a red beard, so he was known as Corman der Reuter, for the red beard. Later, after the turn of the century, they brought a younger brother over, and he was known as Corman der Greener, because he was a greenhorn. So this is kind of some of the stories that were passed on. After about 2 years, in 1893, my grandfather opened a general store, perceiving the opportunities that the farmers needed equipment and clothing and supplies. And his store, his first store, was at the corner of 6th and North Railway, which was directly across from the train station. Now, at that time, I think you're all sitting there on North Railway, between 8th and Nelson, I think the center is. But that had been designated as the commercial street at that time. So that was really all where the businesses congregated across from the train station, which is, I think, the supermarket is sitting where the old train station was. So he was popular. My grandfather was popular with people of all backgrounds, and he was able to converse with his Mennonite customers in their language, in Plattdeutsch, because of the similarities to Yiddish. So there was no, as far as we know, no antagonism among the communities. It was a community that was building together wherever people had come from. In this time, more Jewish families came to Morden, to Winkler, to Plum Cooley. I think we have descendants of some of these, families are certainly on the Zoom here with me, with us. And so many of the Jewish faith came that they needed a place for community worship. So the Steinkopfs had a store, which was at the corner of Nelson and Railway. I think this is where there's a hydro station now. And so the store was given to be the building for the synagogue, which they called the Bnei Israel, or Children of Israel. And, if you go out the door where you're sitting, it's about, I don't know, 50 meters from you now. So my grandfather worked hard, using his knowledge as a grain broker. He helped the farmers to survive through the winter with advances against their future crops. In today's terms, it's being a commodities options broker, but of course, none of the institutions that developed, leading ultimately to the grain exchange, none of that existed. So the trade that he had learned as a young man in the old country came in handy, and it helped him to build his build his new life. I read a piece by historian John Lair, who puts the Jewish immigrants like my grandfather in context. His essay is called "Outside the Colony, Jewish Farmers on the Prairies." And I'll just read a couple lines from this. Across the prairies, Jewish merchants in the villages and small towns that developed around the station halts of the railway companies developed an intimate relationship with agriculture, not only serving as vendors of household and agricultural supplies, but buying and selling livestock and dealing in grain. They constituted a vital part of the rural economy. And so the immigrant from a shtetl outside Kyiv developed his business acumen in Morden's growing economy 125 years ago. In addition to his store, he operated a tannery. He bought a farm, which was the section just east of the experimental farm. So it's kind of amazing to think about a man like this and his contemporaries. How do they get the ability to take these things on and really build their lives and as well as being very much a part of the local community? My father, Milton, who some of you may remember, learned the grain trade from his father. And I remember going around farms with my dad. He'd run the grain through his fingers and evaluate it. And really, I think well into the late 1950s, maybe the early 60s, we had a granary along the tracks, a little bit down from where the major elevators were, but still everything was very individual. If you financed a farmer's crop, it got delivered. This wasn't something like today where it's all just numbers in a computer and you don't know what comes from where. So I remember the granary. Now, my grandfather worked for 6 years, saving to bring his wife and 3 young daughters from Russia. 6 years, he did this on his own. So finally, he had collected enough savings to pay for their passage. And one day in 1897, he took the train to Winnipeg to meet them. He returned to Morden the next day, eager to show them his store and everything he had prepared for them, only to find that there had been a terrible fire and his store had burned down. And the community helped him to rebuild. And, in those days, a pledge of $1, I don't know, you'd have to look up what the inflation rates are, but that would be $100 or more today. And I have the sheets of foolscap with the pledges that everyone made to help this little Jewish man rebuild his business. And they're ticked off as he repaid everyone over a period of time. So this document belongs in an archive somewhere. So we'll take all the suggestions we get, because we have quite a few of these kind of things. So things were looking good for about a year and a half. And then in 1899, tragedy struck. His wife, Leah, and one of his little daughters both died within 11 weeks of each other. And if you go to the Jewish section of the cemetery in Morden, you'll see one monument that's, except for our surname at the bottom, is written entirely in Hebrew characters. Now, it took us quite a while to figure this out, because the language used was actually Yiddish, but it's written in Hebrew. And further, we had to take this to scholars. It's written in idiomatic Russian Yiddish, not the more common German Yiddish. So there we found, finally translated about 2 years ago, that my grandfather's first wife, Leah, and his daughter, Jenny, who died within 10 weeks of each other, are both buried in the same grave. And this is the monument that you can see there. So he was a young man still, he had children, and he needed a wife. So in the old country tradition, a wedding was arranged through a marriage broker. There was a man named Yossel Kluner, who was the first shochet, or kosher butcher, in Winnipeg. And I see on the screen, I don't know if everybody sees the screen, but there's one of my distant cousins who's waving at me there, Bob Steinberg. So Yossel Kluner had a sister, Sonia, who was working in a garment factory in New York, which was, again, that was the whole kind of New York immigrant story. So the wedding was arranged, 1900, and just kind of imagine what it would be for a young woman getting on a train from New York and coming out to this little place in the middle of the Canadian prairies to get married to a man she'd never met. So I happen to have their wedding photo right here. So let's see if everybody can see that. So she was also about 5 inches taller than he was. He was kind of short, and but there they are. Anyway, they went on to have 7 more children. So it was, it was a large and interesting family. And just after the turn of the century, my grandfather brought over his younger brother, Jacob. Well, my grandfather, with his 2 daughters from the first marriage and the 7 children he would go on to create with my grandmother, so there was 9. And my great uncle had 6 children. So the extended Rabinovitch family alone numbered more than 20 people in Morden. I found some documents that are kind of interesting too. So if you walk along Railway Avenue, across from where the station was, beginning at 6th Street, that was my grandfather's store, D. Rabinovitch, General Merchant. A couple of doors to the west, the Jake Corman's store. Then, so that's just a little, Corman store was west of the Manitoba Hotel, which is still standing. Down at the other end of the block, I think where the post office is now and where the old Legion Hall was, that was the Tobias store. And it was quite a large store, and I understand had 8 clerks working there. Later, my grandfather purchased the Tobias store, and he went out of business, and took all the goods and so on to his own store. And as I mentioned earlier, just past the corner of Nelson was the synagogue building, which had been Herman Steinkopf's store. Another little bit of kind of context. In 1903, there were 118 telephones connected to the telephone exchange in Morden. My grandfather's number was 74, so the 74th telephone in town, and that continued to be the number at my father's store until 1959, when we got dial telephones in town. And as a kid, of course, I remember pick up the phone, ring the ringer, and the operator would come on, and I'd say, "Helen, could you get me my dad at the store?" And that's how things were in town. Well, by 1910, my grandfather's family was expanding, and he had prospered over those 20 years. So he bought the Hanson House, which was a large 3-story Victorian, and of course it was torn down in 1947. But I think now between at the corner of Nelson and the north side of Stephen, we have a large residential apartment block. But that whole property was the Hanson House, which became the Rabinovitch House. It was the largest house in town, and they had all these children, extended family, and people going on there. So what was their life like? My grandparents spoke Yiddish at home, and they subscribed to the Yiddish newspapers, which were sent from New York by train. The family was very much a part of the Morden community. The 9 children attended school, and active and creative. They were members of various athletic teams, social clubs, theatrical and musical groups, service organizations, and more. My Uncle Archie and Uncle Bill and my dad joined their father as members of the Masonic Lodge. My Aunt Ruby played piano with the silent movies in the Starland Theater. So, and I know my dad as a teenager worked at the experimental farm. So this was the second generation who, did not have the old country ways, and very much, became Canadians. But with technology and world events and these children growing up, the Jewish community began to melt away. By 1910, beginning of World War I, we're now in a world of telephones, movies, and in the 20s, radio begins. So really beginning with World War I, the children of the original Jewish immigrants to Morden began leaving for Winnipeg and beyond for economic opportunity and education. And just, again, using my father's family as an example for the larger community, of the 7 full brothers and sisters, 5 got university degrees. My Aunt Anne became a nurse. My Uncle Archie became a dentist. He had applied for medical school, but Jews weren't allowed in medical schools. There were quotas, if any were permitted, but dentistry was open. So again, this is how we see the larger history through the stories of these individuals. My Aunt Ruby got a degree in English and later went on to write for the New Yorker and another magazine called The Montrealer. Her pen name in that era, one certainly couldn't have a byline, Ruby Rabinovitch. So she became Rebecca Morden, which is much more Anglophone sounding, and again was a connection to, her heritage of growing up in Morden. Well, and there's one more. Well, my Aunt Beryl also got a BA. So of the my father's immediate brothers and sisters, there were 5 university degrees out of 7 children. But after the war, the community, not only the Jewish community, not only in Morden, but in the other communities along the way, had dwindled. And I found in the town records, this is from May 30th, 1921. A special meeting of the town council was held to approve the purchase of Lot 20, Lot 23, Plan 27, known as the synagogue, from D. Rabinovitch for the sum of $450 and the promise of perpetual care for the Jewish section of the town cemetery. And it's quite moving in a way to see that over 100 years later, that promise is honored, and this small historic place, has kind of much to speak to us. So I have 2 of my aunts are interred there, a number of other relatives, and probably relatives of some of the people I see on Zoom for sure. And I should, and this continued, so that was 1921. Now, around 40 years ago, the town cemetery was needed more space. And I think that's a situation that has, is of the moment now. I understand they're looking for other land to create a second cemetery because the original area, which was deeded by L.V. Morden for this purpose, it's just, there's no more space left. But around 40 years ago, in dealing with this issue, the town asked to move the fence that separates the Jewish consecrated ground from the rest of the cemetery. And so they approached my father as, a descendant. I think he was the trustee of the cemetery at that time. So, and they wrote up an agreement and they had to move the fence. It was, I don't know, it wasn't that far. It was about 8 yards or something like that. But the respect for these agreements, it's quite impressive. And so I don't know if he's in the room, but Jerry Dykeman was the lawyer, and we drew up the documents, and my dad signed this. And again, this is another little part of the history of the town. Jerry, if he's still in practice, purchased a building that on Street had been in my grandmother's name, and for years That's where Joe Weidel operated his tailor shop. And then before he went into, became general manager of my father's store, Ramsey Monahan had the barber shop in the other part of the building. Well, that's where Jerry built his very fine law offices. So just to say that, you know, it's all this history is still, it's a living history. So by the mid-1920s, after the synagogue building was closed, they would hold services, Saturday morning services, in my grandparents' house. There were enough people to come, and they could get a minyan, which is you needed to have 10 men at that time in order to have an official service. So this continued for quite some time. Now, look into the future. So my father and his younger brother, Leon, were the two who didn't go to university. So, and my dad had always worked with his father and in his father's store. So my grandfather bought the property, which many of you will remember, 330 Stephen Street, between 7th and 8th, right in the heart of town, as the commerce of the town was transitioning from Railway Avenue to Stephen Street. And so that was to be a store for my father and his younger brother. And so they put up a sign, Rabinovitch Brothers. Many of you will remember this. But then their older brother, Bill or Wolf, had gone to Chicago, and it's 1929. He said, "This is fantastic here. You guys got to come. What are you doing hanging out there?" And my father, being the generous one, said, "Well, Leon, you go for 6 months and then you come back and I'll go." Well, Leon never came back, but my father never changed the name of the business. So that's kind of the story behind that. My dad, as some of you will remember, was very popular and well known for his community service. He was a volunteer fireman from the late 1930s until 1961. He was general manager of the hockey club for a while. Some of you may have seen the trophy that I found and we donated back to the hockey club. It's on display at the arena. He spent a year as master of the Masonic Lodge. He was president of the Board of Trade, which is the precursor to the Chamber of Commerce. And for a period, he was chairman of the board of the Morden District Hospital. So we kind of see this evolution from these shtetl Jews who spoke Yiddish and Russian, becoming Canadians, becoming part of a community in which there were varied backgrounds and everyone respected each other. I don't know if John Weens is there, but John told me a wonderful story. There was a man named Stan Chark who came to town in the early 1960s. And Stan was a black man. Well, there were no people of color in Morden, or maybe even the whole province, at that period. So when he was introduced to my father, my dad said, "Well, welcome. Now there are two minorities in town." So I thought that was a good line. Kind of a story that kind of pulls this together. I spoke a few minutes ago about the generosity of the community in assisting my grandfather to rebuild when his store had burned down. So a number of years ago, I was in town, and a Mennonite man, I think his surname was Pauls, but I didn't take notes. He said, my father wants to talk to you about your grandfather. And I said, he can't want to talk to me about my grandfather. My grandfather passed away in 1946. He's not old enough. He must be thinking about my dad. He said, no, he brought his father, who was about 85 at the time. And their story was that they were refugees from Stalin's persecution of the Mennonites, who came to town around 1930. And like my ancestors, had nothing, had to find a way to survive and live, and they were looking for somewhere to live. And someone had pointed out that there was a farmhouse on my grandfather's farm just east of town, and no one was living in that. So they approached my grandfather, and he said, fine, you live there, fix up that house, paint the house, grow a garden, and sell the produce so you will have an income. And so they moved in there, and once a year, and this is what this gentleman, the story related to me, my grandfather would come up the steps and rap on the door with his cane and ask for the rent. And they said, but Doc, his nickname was Doc, how could we pay you the rent? Look, the fields are blowing away. There's, it was the Dust Bowl. It was difficult. And the response was, the government asks for the taxes from me, not from you. So that's why you have to pay the rent. And in the Jewish faith, there are 7 forms of charity. And the highest form is to give a man the ability to stand on his own 2 feet. So I think this vignette, this story, really is an example of that, of kind of the old way coming to the new land. So by the mid-1940s, there were no other Jewish families living in Morden. And certainly when I came along, I was the only Jewish kid in town, but that's another story. So, open to questions.
Okay, anybody have a question, just speak up and we'll see if David can hear us.
Store in town here.
While the lights are up, I can see you better.
Okay.
In your store in town here, you have a bunch of customs upstairs. Customs for clothing. Like Tivor Centers could rent customs from all your clothes upstairs.
Oh, then it's not clear, but I'll put in my other earphone and see if this gets any better. Sorry.
Vintage clothing that was found upstairs in the Rabinovitch store.
Yes.
And what did you do with those when the store closed?
Oh, okay. Well, yes. First the business closed, and Ramsey Monahan, who some of you will remember, was a wonderful man, and he came to work after my family moved to Winnipeg. Came to work as the general manager, but really for the next until about 1980. My dad would come to town once a week. Saturdays were the big day, and in those days, Saturday the stores stayed open till 9, and before the shopping patterns changed. But by 1990, my father was in his 80s, and Ramsey was in ill health, so they wrapped up the business. And in 1997, my father sold the building. So over the years, now remember he moved into that building in 1927. Over the years, goods that were out of fashion, overstocked, whatever, they went upstairs until you could hardly get through the door into the upstairs because it was so packed with all this inventory. Now, my father really wasn't very concerned about it. It was, yeah, but the new owners, you know, they need you to clear it out. And I had the idea, vintage clothing, because we had everything going back to, well, even goods from my grandfather's store that had come over to my dad's store, you know, so we had goods going back to 1910. I found the ledger book from 1910 to 1937. You know, relating to the subject of this conversation, there was a large ledger and everything written down. But my grandfather's notes for those whose accounts were delinquent, he wrote those notes in Yiddish on the margin of the, so it was now, but your question was what happened to all the goods up there? I got on the internet, it's late 1990s, and you know, vintage clothing was just starting to take off from every era. So there used to be a show on television called That 70s Show. Well, they got a lot of wardrobe, all that awful polyester stuff that we used to wear. They got a lot of wardrobe from there. We had men's underwear, you know, going back for years and years, and what they called, you know, the tank top underwear, which in the trade they're now called wife beaters. We had 400 units. Well, that went to a shop on Melrose Avenue in Los Angeles that, you know, they loved all these things. So that's what happened is we shipped. It's amazing how much the building held, because you don't think of the weight of clothing, and it came to over 2 tons of clothing that we shipped, you know, to various all these American buyers. So we had vintage clothing from New York to LA, from and shoes, and even I have a few things left. I have a child mannequin from 1919, I think. I can't bear to part with her, but I just don't know what to do with these things. Bathing suits. When men used to wear bathing suits with tops, you know, and everything, they're from 1929. So anyway, that's what happened. Was we went into the vintage business, and at the age of 88, for a summer, my dad had some fun with it, and you know, buyers were flying in. We'd drive out to town, and you know, and go through everything. So that's the story.
There was an article in a newspaper about the vintage clothes, and of course, I was at the Chamber of Commerce then, and I was absolutely inundated with phone calls from people wanting to buy some of this stuff. And it could be stuff that you were in contact with as well. But it was crazy. Everybody.
Well, I wish you'd called us at the time. But you know, but you know, even after my family moved to Winnipeg, I would work in the store in the summers, and you know, very much a part of a way of keeping connected, and as I still try to do by, you know, things like this event.
Yeah.
Can I share a story with you, David? Can you hear me?
Who's there?
If you come right up close, he'll hear you better.
Hi,
That's
David.
better.
Good. I'm Ellen Martins. I'm a Shaskovsky by my maiden name. But I want to tell you
Oh,
something.
you're a Tchaikovsky. Okay.
No, Shaskovsky. I was Polish.
Ah, okay.
Yes. I just want to share with you what a blessing your father was to me. I was a young teacher in south of Morden, and I would come into town on a Saturday night with my check. And I would go to the store and I would say to your dad, "Can you cash my check for me?" And he said, well, is it very big? And I said, yes, it's pretty big. It probably was under $300.
That was
And-
big.
It was big. And he would reach into his pocket and take out this wad of bills, and he'd peel them off and give them to
I
me.
know that wad of bills.
A blessing to me. I just wanted you to know that.
Well, thank you. It really, really warms my heart when I hear these stories.
Now I wanted to ask a question. Did many or any, after the Second World War, Holocaust survivors come this direction, or do you know anything of that, or? My mother is a Holocaust survivor, actually. Yeah,
Not, well, not exactly, although, I have to retrieve the name, which will take me a moment. Sorry, I can't come up with offbeat. But some of you may, well, yes. But this is, Leon Mitchell, who some of you may remember, was a refugee, a Jewish refugee who came to town, and he married Dr. Leslie. Dr. Leslie was the head of the experimental farm for 40 years, I think. A wonderful man and one. He married one of Dr. Leslie's daughters. But that's the only one specifically that I can think of relating to that.
I was more just curious. My mother was on the Kinder transport from Danzig just before the war started. So I was just interested if, she never came here, but I was just interested in that kind of a direction for the Jews. Yeah, you've answered
I'm not aware of anything like that specifically.
No, it's fine. Good. It's interesting what you've already brought forward. Thank you.
So you might want to ask, you've got some of my relatives here on Zoom, you might want to ask them questions, or I don't know if you see Harvey and Ruthie up there on the screen, but Harvey's a real historian of southern Manitoba, who in fact, when he saw the notice of this, sent me this photo, which is, that's my grandfather Doc with Ruthie's grandparents here, and I think it looks to me like they came from Plum Coulee to Morden to visit. Although, again, even in the 50s as a kid, we would stop driving into Winnipeg you'd stop in Plum Coulee and have lunch with the Rosners. The Diamonds owned the hotel. If we went in Highway 3, I can't remember the name offhand, but there was a Jewish farmer right by the grain elevators in Brunkild. So this kind of network, lasted for a long time, and people were very, very supportive.
So, thanks very much, David. This is really fascinating. You just showed a picture of my mother's parents, and so this is very dear to us, and we were related to the Rabinovitches. So your grandmother, Saucy, I'm named after her. In Yiddish, my middle name is Saucy. Yeah. And can you tell me anything more about her? I heard that their place was always a open house. That was where you went in Morden, and there was so much going on. Now I understand why.
Yes, well, if you see, there's a photo of the house in the Brown book, in the 1982 book, but it doesn't have our name on it. It says the Hanson House because it was built by the first mayor. But I had never seen it, but growing up, my dad would say, it was so big, we played baseball in the attic and tennis on the veranda. And it's like, you grew up in a bungalow and like, no. But then you see the house and you go, yeah, I mean, it was so, and all these children, 9 in my father's family and 6 in my great uncle's family, and then the Cluners, your ancestors, and they came back and forth from the city. So yes, you can just picture this constant hub of activity and people connecting in that way. So it was really quite something.
Was she a good cook or what? What was her?
Well, I never knew my grandparents. They were gone before I came around. But yes, they said my grandmother was a wonderful cook, and as a young man, she had a large garden on the farm, which, as I said, was where, I'm not sure what's there now, but it's where the Tupperware plant opened. But that was their farm. That was the large farm. And so my dad would go out with his mother and to plant and tend the garden. And that was all through the 1920s and 30s. So that's, and I think that's the farm where the Paul's family rented the house. So it's, I find for me, it's, even if the buildings aren't there, there's something about just the place. And this was very much, of the place.
Oh, great.
Number of years ago, the children of Sadie Bronfman, of the Bronfman family, came back to this area to tour Morden and Plumcooley before she passed away. And they just absolutely loved it. Have you heard of other families that have sort of grew up in this area that come back, or their descendants came back to tour?
Well, probably the most well known would be the Bronfmans, who of course became Seagram's Liquor, and Sadie Bronfman. There's the Sadie Bronfman Center for the Arts in Montreal, but they were all part of this southern Manitoba Jewish community. So I know I had some relatives who made a pilgrimage a few years ago, and they got it all wrong, but that's okay, because it's still, none of them had ever grown up there. I grew up there, so I had a very different sense, and I feel very rewarded when I can still walk around town and pop in, and I'm acquainted with people, so it's a special part of my life and career.
Right.
And I guess this is an opportunity to, I've learned that writers are supposed, get to do something called shameless self-promotion. So this is my book,
Yes.
which tells the story of one of my father's brothers who, hold down on screen, there's a poster too, who in the 1940s made a jukebox that revolutionized the coin machine industry, made millions. It all blew up in a patent case that went to the American Supreme Court. And later, in the 1950s, took the fall for what the US Department of Justice called the largest money laundering scheme in history. And I think anybody who doesn't have it, if you're in Morden, they may still have a few copies left at the Pembina Hills Arts Center. We had a wonderful book launch event there a year ago, November. And for anybody who's not there, it's in your local bookstore, or I kind of reluctantly have to say, it's also on Amazon. So easy to get. And yes, we are working on adapting it as a television series, but I should live so long.
I ordered that book from Amazon on Friday. I got it last Sunday and I finished it yesterday.
Well, I hope you had a good read.
I enjoyed it.
Is there any possibility that that could be a movie? I mean, if it's a perfect hour and a half, 2 hour movie, and it was a great read, very interesting, Wolf, must have been a very interesting man. And, it would be nice to have our third movie here in Morden, and we're available.
Well, I will ask you this, having given such a nice review. If you take a minute or two and go on Amazon and write what you just said, those readers' comments, I have learned, are very helpful in attracting readers to a book. So anyone who feels motivated, I would appreciate that.
David. My name's David. I think I have a sport coat I bought at the Rabinovitch store in 1989. I double checked the story today. My 93-year-old mother-in-law says her mother said in the early part of the 1900s, in her words, the Jewish peddler would come around with his horse and tray from yard to yard and negotiate with housewares and sewing stuff for chickens and produce to take to the store to sell. So there was a mercantile system involving the rural people here.
Yeah, I don't know, I can't see who's talking, but I know you're there somewhere. But, okay, yes, very much so. As I said, in terms of the grain, the chickens, I mean, you name it, they traded in everything. We talk about the agricultural economy. And it didn't necessarily have to be a cash economy. Trade was effective, and this is later than the period I was asked to speak about. But again, when we opened up the safe, there was lots of things that came out. My father's good friend was Bay McKennett. And of course, Lorena has just been honored by the nomination to the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. But I found an order for like 4,000 dozen eggs. That's a lot of eggs. But my dad brokered the deal, so the eggs came from the McKennett. They also had the Morden Dairy, and they brokered the eggs to. I'm pointing at my screen, but to Ruthie's cousins, who my dad had helped finance them to open a cold storage company in Winnipeg. So this North Star Cold Storage. So I don't know if you see everybody here who's online, but I do. So, but that's very much down to that level that you're talking about, whether it was door to door. I mean, that's a lot of eggs, 4,000 dozen eggs. And it was just having the receipt for that. So I don't know if she's online, but I'd sent that to Joyce McKennett a couple of years ago. So I am in touch with, a number of people from Morden and people I grew up with, and, Joni's brother, Jimmy Larkey, and I were trying to do a trip to town together a couple of years ago, except I got COVID. So maybe we'll try it again. We have a milestone birthday coming up, so maybe we can put that together. It's great. I love hearing these stories from you. So.
That's wonderful, everyone. We are taking up some of David's extra time, so you need to get him back to the beach.
Well, no, this is really a pleasure. As I said, I really enjoy connecting in town, and hope to maybe get out there next summer.
Wonderful. I'll be in Cabo in about a week and a half, so.
Did you say Cabo? Well, call us. We're in a little town called Todos Santos, which is an hour's drive north of Cabo. And we think of this
that's
as
where the Hotel California is. right close to that.
Yes, well, we see the whales right from the shore. You don't have to, where we are here, you don't have to go to book any fancy ships or anything. You just go to the shore and you see them
Yeah,
playing
watch
out there. It's fantastic. We have actually, I think it's all right to share this, but we have a volunteer fire department here. And some time ago, I was talking to Andy Thiessen at the fire department about the situation here, and Andy is organizing the municipality of La Paz, which is 70 miles from us here. It's a volunteer department. They give them $100 a month for gas for the truck, and that's it. So, you know, with volunteer firefighters everywhere, we owe them a lot. And this really brought tears to Andy's eyes. And he's been organizing a whole shipment of equipment to send down here. So maybe there's a bridge from Todos Santos to Morden.
Yes. Sounds good. Anyway, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Cheryl. It's really been a pleasure to talk with everybody. And thank you for all my friends online who signed in for this.
Sounds great. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And
Cheryl, what's next in the history series?
well, there won't be anything in February because I'm going to be away. So the next two will be information about the war history and another one on the history of healthcare in March. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you,
Thanks,
David.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
So long.
Okay, so long. Bye-bye. Thank you.